The 6 sources of Unitarian Universalism did not exist until the 1980s, when the Unitarian Universalist Association revised its principles and purposes. The 7 principles and purposes of the Unitarian Universalist Association did not exist until the consolidation of the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America in 1961. When these 2 denominations combined, our new faith of Unitarian Universalism was born, and the leaders of each group had to work out what were the religious ideas that bound them together in this new venture. 2 groups with a long liberal Christian history, one of them having become very humanist in its orientation, had to work out not only what this statement would be, but its language. Warren Ross, writing about Unitarian Universalist history in the UU World, said, "The contention revolved around whether to include such phrases as love to God and love to man, and a reference to our Judeo-Christian heritage. A compromise version, including a critical change from our heritage to the heritage, was finally hammered out, as it is in church meetings, in an all-day, all-night parliamentary negotiation and debate. What they came up with is similar to our present principles, but did not include the interdependent web of all existence, and the wording was very sexist in its language, with things like the brotherhood of man, goodwill among men, and so on. These principles lasted well through the 70s, and when Reverend Eugene Pickett became Unitarian Universalist Association president in 1979, part of his agenda was updating, as was called for by the bylaws, the principles. Pickett said, "The deeper malaise lies in our confusion as to what word we have to spread. The old watchwords of liberalism, reason, freedom, tolerance, worthy though they may be, are simply not catching the imagination of the contemporary world. They describe a process for approaching religious depths, but they testify to no intimate acquaintance with these depths themselves. If we are ever to speak to a new age, we must supplement our seeking with some profound religious finds." UUs were debating the principles, and UU women and UU women clergy began working on versions with much less sexist language, after a UU women's gathering gave a vote of no confidence to the principles due to the sexist language. In 1981, a non-sexist revision of the 1961 language was presented to the General Assembly by various women's groups. The birth of the 6 sources happened during the debates over the language for the revised principles and purposes during the General Assembly in Maine in 1982. The issue, as in 1961, was a divide between those who favored Christian language and those who did not. The Reverend Harry Haler, minister at one of our still Christian congregations in nearby Western Massachusetts, came up with a solution. He proposed dividing the statement into 2 parts, the principles, and then a statement of the various sources of religious wisdom common among us, or, as he said, the 5 living traditions which we all share. The earth-centered religious traditions was added to the statement in 1995. Humanists and atheists dropped objection to the Christian language when it was referenced as part of a list of historical religious influences on our present tradition. And so the revised principles and sources were circulated to congregations for feedback. The only major change as a result of this was inclusion for the respect of the interdependent web of existence for which we are all a part, which came as a suggestion from many congregations around the country. The revised principles and sources were approved by 2 consecutive General Assemblies, according to our bylaws, in 1984 and 1985. The 1984 vote was very favorable, and in 1985, near unanimous with only 1 dissenting vote. The principles and purposes are the very beginning of the Unitarian Universalist Association's bylaws. They are introduced with the statement, "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote." Then the principles are listed. Following the principles is the statement, "The living tradition which we share draws from many sources." And then the 6 sources are listed. Following the listing of the 6 sources is the statement, "Grateful for the religious pluralism which enriches and ennobles our faith, we are inspired to deepen our understanding and expand our vision. As free congregations, we enter into this covenant, promising to one another our mutual trust and support." Some important things to note about the principles and sources. 1, they are statements of covenantal promises, not statements of belief. And the covenant they refer to is a covenant between and among our congregations, not between and among individual Unitarian Universalists. These principles have come in practice to be almost a substitute dogma or creed. When people are asked what they believe as Unitarian Universalists or what Unitarian Universalism is, many of us will turn to the principles and tell people this is a kind of summary of what we believe. But they were written as a bond between our congregations. That our congregations are in covenant with each other is often forgotten. Far too often, individual congregations practice their Unitarian Universalism in isolation. And there are territorial squabbles and even conflict between neighboring churches. When, as part of the membership in the association, the congregations covenant and promise to lend each other trust and mutual support. The covenantal truth is that we are beginning here to practice in earnest in our congregation our growing relationship in trust and support with the Milford congregation, the Marlborough, Hudson, Northborough, and Upton Grafton congregations. The 6 sources present a list of common sources of religious truth and inspiration shared among our congregations. Some of these sources may be very present in your own spiritual journey, and some not at all. Although they are not a creed or a dogma, I think we affirm them all equally because there is almost always someone, even if one person, in any gathering of Unitarian Universalists for whom each source rings true. It reminds me of a statement by Nadia Bowles-Weber, a Lutheran pastor, who was asked why she recites the Apostles' Creed if she doesn't believe everything in it. And she said, well, you know, if you have a room full of Christians, there'll be at least one person in the room who believes all that stuff in the creed. They might all believe all the same thing, but something is true for everybody in the room. And I think that's true for our 6 sources of Unitarian Universalism. As we go through the sources, some of them may not be very powerful in your own spiritual life, but I guarantee there's someone in the room for whom they are. So, these sources. 1, the direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which move us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and sustain life. The first source points to awe. Ian Lamont says there are 3 prayers. Help, thanks, wow. Our first source is wow. It names what I call the experience of religious truth, that feeling of deep connection that is often beyond words, the experience of what you know is so because it resonates with your heart, your experience, your understanding, your emotions, your very being, regardless of whether or not you can communicate it to others, prove it as factual, or measure it in any way. The first source supports the truth of the human experiences of being lost in prayer, in deep stillness of meditation, the wondrous understandings of the complexity of quantum mechanics or the awe of the vastness of space, being lost in the beauty of art and poetry and music. Our second source The words and deeds of prophetic men and women which challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. Religious truth, we claim, is not limited to the Law of Moses, the Sermon on the Mount, the letters of St. Paul, the recitation of the Quran, or the words of Buddha. Muhammad is not the last prophet. There are no last prophets. There will always be another prophetic voice to join a long line of prophetic voices, from the biblical prophets to the prophet Muhammad, to Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Martin Luther King Jr. and Mohandas Gandhi and Dorothy Day and Archbishop Romero and Harvey Milk and Aung San Suu Kyi, and on and on and on. All the voices that remind us to harness the power of love to battle the injustices and oppressions and hatreds and violence in the world. Our third source, wisdom from the world's religions, which inspire us in our ethical and spiritual life. From whatever religious tradition, if a teaching ennobles the ethical life and the life of the Spirit, we claim it as a source of religious truth. The third source reminds us that human experience is similar in so many ways across time and across culture. Wise teachings from the length of history and around the world draw us back again and again to kindness, compassion, relationship, mutuality, fairness, and peace. In some way, in some language, loving your neighbor as yourself is a piece of wisdom found in a vast multitude of expressions throughout human history. Our fourth source, Jewish and Christian teachings which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbor as ourselves. The Judeo-Christian tradition is the cornerstone and the foundation of Unitarianism, Universalism, and Unitarian Universalism. Unitarian Universalism, as it was born in 1961, when the two faiths merged, but both branches of our faith were specifically Christian in their history. The Unitarian branch developed over the last century and a half into a very humanistic and humanist tradition. The Universalists, however, were still Trinitarian Christians in 1961 at the merger. This fourth source, noting the Jewish and Christian heritage, discourages us from dismissing Christianity as if Christianity were a monolith. Remembering our roots calls us to see a broader Christianity and a broader expression of that tradition. That it is not just a solid monolith of fundamentalism and intolerance. Remembering our Christian roots benefits us as it allows us to enter into broader religious and cultural dialogue and conversation in a society that really is formed and steeped in the Christian tradition. There are largely humanistic liberal Christianities in abundance today, and they need our allegiance and our help in combating the negatives of the Christian tradition, and our help in promoting the religious truths taught by Jesus, instead of the religion that is about Jesus, but strays so far from his teaching and example as to be unrecognizable as coming from him or the early Christian church. The fifth source is humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the result of science and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. The fifth source is where the older, broader, liberal Christian tradition and the Unitarian markers of reason, freedom, and tolerance live on most fully. We consider it a religious truth that the scientific method is real, that it gives us the best way we've yet discovered to map knowledge, understand the complex workings of the physical world. And at the same time, the source of truth guards us against the mistake of making anything, even science and reason itself, into an idol. Making reason itself into a god and forgetting that although we are possessed of reason, we are also emotional creatures at heart. There exists fundamentalism and atheism as much as in any other religious tradition, where you can broker no idea or approach to anything but your own. To dismiss religion entirely and to belittle all religion is to violate the spirit of our fifth principle, which calls us to recognize the religious truths of science and reason. The sixth source, spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. This source was the last to be included in our covenant between congregations. It calls us to acknowledge the presence of the feminine divine energy. It calls us to delve deeply into our seventh principle about an interdependent web of all existence. And it wasn't until this sixth source was added that our green sanctuary movement was born and gained strength. We would probably not be a green sanctuary here if this source was not added in the 1990s. This source, along with the fifth source, calls us powerfully to environmental work, to fight the idolatry of mind and spirit that is climate change denial. The sixth source may be the place where actually most Unitarian Universalists demonstrate our faith through our daily religious behavior. We reuse, we recycle, we repurpose, we garden, we walk in the woods. This one may be where most of us find our daily practice of our own faith. These sources cover a lot of ground as a whole, but they do not represent a religious tradition where you can believe whatever you want. We proclaim a free search for truth and meaning, but it must be a responsible one as well. One recent example during my time in ministry that I experienced as possibly being an irresponsible search of truth was when the popularity of The Secret and Law of Attraction became fairly big in some UU congregations. If you're not familiar with this was a 2006 book and movie by someone named Rhonda Byrne. It was promoted by Oprah Winfrey. And Byrne's secret is what she calls the law of attraction. And she claims this is a universal law. Well, universal laws are applicable all the time and in all places. The law of gravity, the law of planetary motion. The law of attraction cannot be proven to be such a law. The law of attraction says that like attracts like, and when you think and feel what you want to attract on the inside, this law will use people, circumstances, and events to materialize what it is you want to you. Well, we could drop down in the middle of Aleppo, Syria today, and I bet there'd be a lot of people with all the intent they can muster wishing they weren't in a war zone, needing to leave their own country as refugees. But, despite all their intention, it goes on. Because real human injustice has real oppositional factors that willfully obstruct any good intention and wishful thinking, which is basically what The Secret is all about. Someday, the situation in Aleppo and other places such as it around the world will change, but it won't be due to the law of attraction, which, if it were so powerful, would have stopped the violence and calamity in all these places long ago as people focused their intent to end it. So, we are not a religion, despite all our sources, where you can believe whatever you want. It all doesn't work out. We call each other to be responsible in our search for truth and meaning, which is why we still have a liberal Christian group of Unitarian Universalists, but they're not going to proclaim to you the literal inerrancy of the Bible, because it's not reasonable. In addition to our six sources, our free and responsible search for truth and meaning requires active participation. Each of these sources of truth are sifted through each one of us, through our mind and our heart and our emotions and our relationships. Each Unitarian Universalist professes a uniquely different combination of each of these six sources of truth and builds that into their own individual Unitarian Universalism. Mine is heavy on the third source and the first. Yours might be heavy on the fifth or the sixth. Or you might be a person for whom they all seem to work in equal balance together. Each of us, as Kathleen Rowlands noted, dances with the holy in different ways. These sources provide a wide spectrum for people to come together from different spiritualities into one faith community and dance together. Each of us, through the process of recognizing and learning from and being formed by these sources in combination, becomes a source of truth to ourselves and to others. The way these sources combine in us makes each of us a source of mystery and wonder and a prophetic voice to the world. May our continued exploration of these 6 sources of truth provide us with the experience of the depth of religious experience Reverend Pickett encouraged when he called for the 6 sources to be born.